welcome to SETA DC webinars. And this week we will be discussing the world reactions on George Floyd incidents and demonstrations. And we have seen that there are demonstrations not only in the United States now, it has been more than 2 weeks, and the demonstrations are spreading to Europe, Australia, Latin America, and even in the Middle East nowadays. And we have two panelists today, Dr. Ho-Fung from Johns Hopkins University and Mr. Daragahi from Atlantic Council, a senior non-resident fellow at Atlantic Council. And I will start asking them several questions about their perspective about the reaction to the events in the world. And following that, I will get your questions. You can write your questions to on Zoom. If you are on Zoom, you can write to the question box or the chat box. If you are following it from on YouTube, Instagram, or any other social media and Twitter, you can write it as a comment. My assistants will pick those questions up for me, and I will ask our panelists. The first question we will start with Dr. Hung. Let's start with a general questions. Why are there demonstrations around the world? We have seen similar events in United States before, in 2014 in Missouri, in 2015 in Baltimore, even several years ago, Eric Garner event in New York. There were demonstrations in United States. There were large demonstrations, but it wasn't a demonstration. It didn't cause a demonstration around the world. So yes. Why around this time that other people around the world are also interested in what is happening in terms of race relations in the United States?
Yes, definitely that this kind of protest usually, or the issue itself usually sparks, and that trigger long accumulated grievances about all kind of things. And for example, a few years ago when Missouri, when Freddie Gray in Baltimore, there's the Black Lives Matter movement started. It didn't trigger a lot of worldwide protests at that time, but this time it did. I think in different continents, they have different reasons, particularly, for example, in Europe, in UK, first thing, it is the pandemic that people have been frustrated about all kinds of things for a long time. And at the same time, there's a growing sentiment of anti-Americanism under President Trump that many people in Europe, in particular, in other parts of the world, also are frustrated about the direction the world is heading. So all these kind of grievances, though not directly related to George Floyd killing and to the racial relation in the US, but all these add up together to trigger the people. And you can see that, and in different places, people are protesting not only in the public square, but also in front of the American embassies. And of course, then, and some of the protesters in Europe also complain about the racism in their own countries, in France, in Germany, racism in different forms, and particularly in UK, that there's a lot of protests against the legacies of colonialism, against UK involvement in the slave trade in the old time. So all these kind of things add together, particularly under the condition of the pandemics, that people are in lockdown and the economy is tanking. So there's a lot of underlying grievances and anger that is triggered by this particular spark of the protests of Black Lives Matters in the US.
How about you, Mr. Daragahi? What do you think? Why?
Well, yeah, I tend to agree that it does have to do to some extent with animosity towards the current administration in Washington, the Trump administration, and its right-wing pseudo-populism, its belligerence towards the rest of the world. I think that in the U.S., very much this was a protest not just against police brutality, but against Trumpismo, such as it is, and the white supremacist ideas that are behind Trumpismo, so to speak. I also think that there is a kind of, there's the coronavirus aspect, which fostered senses of both fear and solidarity among people all over the world. And I also think there's just a particular moment that the image of this man kind of captured this image of this man under a policeman's knee for 8 minutes and 46 seconds. It was just so dramatic and so extreme, so much more extreme than things that we've seen. And it was sort of this very horrifying and poetic image that is a potential kind of harbinger of the human condition under the authoritarian surveillance states that are growing up all over the planet, the high-tech repressive apparatuses that are kind of sprouting up all over the world under the guise of, you know, populism, so to speak. And I think that this is very much a reaction to that. There's very much a reaction to the frustration and fear of that vision of humanity, of being crushed by the knee of a cop.
So just a follow-up for this, again, for both of you. Since you both mentioned there is a global reaction to certain things that is happening in regards to white supremacy and right-wing activism around the world, do you think will there be any reflection of these demonstrations to the elections this year in the United States and next year? Several countries, including Germany, have their elections in Europe.
Yeah, in the U.S., that definitely the protests and the unrest and the turmoil will have effect on the election. That the common wisdom is that this image of chaos and turmoil and unrest is a reflection of the incompetence of the administration. Of course, to be fair, this Black Lives Matter and this white supremacy, this police brutality problem didn't start with Trump. That it started many years ago. Actually, never went away even after the civil rights movement. But the Black Lives Matter itself actually started under Obama administration. But this time around, people still blame Trump because it seems that people are complaining the administration is not doing a particularly effective job in calming down the situation, but on the other hand, saying things and treating things that might further provoke the people. So people will still blame Trump on this. But at the same time, some conservative people and analysts would think that this the image of looting, chaos, and with some minorities of people who take advantage of the protest to loot shops and things like that, and then magnified it in the media, that it will create a kind of a panic about law and order that might, in some more conservative or swing states, might provoke some of the conservative voter to vote for Trump. So it is still difficult to see how foresee how the impact of the protest will be benefiting Trump or hurting Trump. In the end, the election will be determined by the economic and employment situation and the economy in a large part. And at this point, of course, it is not looking very well for Trump, but it can change over the next few months.
Borzou?
Well, I mean, let's just look at history. In 1992, we had a one-term Republican president. There was spring race riots over the Rodney King beating. And, you know, he lost that year, in part. George Bush, the first, lost that year after one term as president to the Democrat Bill Clinton with widespread African-American support. And then you look at 1968, which was also a year of riots and, you know, chaos. And the Democratic Party was in chaos. You know, that year, the Democrats also lost to Richard Nixon because of economic problems. There was also, actually, interestingly, in '68, there was a pandemic as well, the Hong Kong flu, the so-called Hong Kong flu, and the incumbent party lost. So in general, in US history, riots and economic troubles spell bad news for the incumbent party in terms of the presidency. I think there's another factor here. There's massive political mobilization against Trump, unprecedented. And you saw that in 2018 midterm elections, this gelling coalition that had historic gains in those congressional and Senate elections for the Democrats. And I have a feeling unless Trump is able to pull something out of his hat and win some support among some key constituencies, specifically suburban white women voters who are turned off to him at this point, he's probably going to lose.
Actually, today's New York Times polls also showed that Biden is leading with women, actually, in a potential race between Biden and Trump. So, Dr. Hong, I want to move a little bit about the reaction around the world and ask you a question about China and how China reacted to this. You recently published an article on in foreign policy, and you mentioned China's critique about the Floyd incident, of course, doesn't stem from a genuine concern for universal human rights and the well-being of African Americans. So what was China reacting to?
Definitely trying to take advantage of the protests, and then the official medias and some spokespersons of the foreign ministries also explicitly tweet or talk about the George Floyd death killing, and also the protests as a sign that the U.S. has a lot of human rights abuse problem, and saying that U.S. has been hypocritical when it criticized China's human rights record and things like that. But it is interesting that to contrast China's response to the George Floyd triggered protests in the U.S. and other reaction of other countries. That what stands out is that in other countries, in Latin America, in Middle East, in Europe, the response are from the society. People are protesting spontaneously against the U.S., against racism, against all kind of thing. And the government of these countries are careful not to comment publicly on the situation. In China, it's the opposite. That you don't see any spontaneous protests among the people, not even protests in front of U.S. embassy and things like that. It is totally controlled, and there's low civil society response. And the response is only in official medias and government spokespersons and things like that. So it is difficult to gauge what is the sentiment among the common people, among the civil society, what they think about the George Floyd incidents and the protests, the Black Lives Matter. But definitely that the government's response is not quite sincere in terms of its alleged support of African Americans' livelihood and rights, and also human rights in the U.S. Because we all know that in China there is also a problem of racism in China's social media, which is controlled very heavily by the government. You can see a lot of posting against African American, because now in certain southern cities in China there's a huge presence of African migrants now, but they face a lot of institutional daily life discrimination and in the social media. So they are a lot censored, while the government censor everything else. And in the pandemic, that they are also the Africans, people in South China is also rounded up and being excluded in rentals, arrangement and things like that. So the racism is not against African American. It's not non-existent in China, and at the same time, police brutality and human rights abuse and against Uyghurs. So we know about this education camps and all these abuses around in China. So when China is talking about the U.S. police brutality and abuse of human rights, they are just trying to say, look, U.S. is as bad as us. So the U.S. shouldn't criticize China. We have our right to be like the U.S., to be abusive. And so it is very different from the civil society response around the world, which is really about the human rights abuse and the police brutality.
So one more question about this. When we look at in 1990s, especially early 2000s, when there are issues about United States EP-3 plane crash in Hainan Island, or when Prime Minister Abe visited Yasukuni Shrine in Tokyo, there was huge demonstrations in Chinese cities. And the Chinese government allowed the protest in front of the US embassy. Why do you think this time Chinese government didn't allow such a protest in front of the US embassies or in the cities of China?
Yeah, at that time, both incidents. One is, I think it is the Belgrade bombing of the Chinese embassy during the Kosovo War. And the second time is the South China spy plane incidents in which the Chinese fighter plane pilot died as a result. So they are both directly, some Chinese nationals are killed by U.S. military, accidentally or deliberately, then depending on your perspective. So at that time, that the popular anger is very clear. That in the civil society, that you can see and you can understand that people are actually angry about the U.S. because they think that the U.S. military killed some Chinese nationals in bombing in the skirmish in the open South China Sea. So the Chinese government need to let some steam out, and so they have this controlled demonstration. Actually, demonstrators are bust in to the neighborhood of the U.S. embassy to protest in front of the embassy, and then they are bussed away. Yeah. So the government know that you need to let the steam out because some Chinese lives are involved, but they want to keep it under control. So they orchestrate this demonstration to make sure that it won't get out of control. And also over Japan is the same. It's about directly about Chinese territory or Chinese claim the territory. And this time around, low Chinese life and Chinese territory directly is involved, and it is about some other groups' lives and rights. And the Chinese government definitely don't think that they need to let some steam out, and the popular anger against the U.S. I don't think is as big as back in those incidents in the old times.
Mr. Daragahi, the same questions about the world's reaction and going to the Middle East. Iran reacted heavily for these demonstrations, especially Ayatollah Khamenei made a statement actually about the killing of George Floyd and the demonstrations after that. What do you think about those reactions in Iran?
Well, I think that, you know, Iran, the supreme leader, Ali Khamenei, has a long history of, look, Iranians watch closely what's happening in the United States. People in the Middle East in general, in Turkey, they know far more about what's happening in the United States through Hollywood and through the news than Americans know about what's going on. You know, I mean, Iranians know who Nancy Pelosi is. How many Americans could name the speaker of the Iranian parliament, you know? So, you know, there is a kind of close watch on what happens in the United States. Many Iranians, maybe many people in the Middle East have relatives in the United States that they, you know, connect to the story there. They know about this. Everyone knows the story of African Americans in the United States. People learn about slavery, the history of slavery in the United States, but they don't know anything about the history of slavery, for example, in Iran or the Ottoman Empire. They don't like even study that in school. So, you know, there's a familiarity with this story, with this narrative, and it affects people. It affects people emotionally. So I don't think when the Supreme Leader talks about this stuff, when he brings up human rights issues in the United States, it's not just for political, you know, opportunism. That's there. But they're also genuinely following this. They're genuinely following the story in the United States. In the same way, perhaps, you know, post-war Germany in the 50s and 60s and 70s was really fixated on, you know, what was happening in the United States and the jazz culture that would come over from the United States and the ongoing kind of cultural exchanges that were happening there. So yes, there is this political opportunism on the part of the Syrian government, on the part of the Iranian government, on the part of even of the Egyptian government was sort of raising concerns about the treatment of African Americans in the United States and so on after this incident. But I also think that because of Hollywood, because of the entertainment industry, the United States kind of occupies a unique space in the imagination of people in the Middle East and Europe. I don't know so much about Far East Asia. I imagine a little bit there. And because of that, there is a genuine concern about what happened here and a genuine, almost visceral reaction of, hey, America, why aren't you living up to your ideals?
In your, you recently wrote a piece about this to the Atlantic Council's blog. And you mentioned the Mohammed Bouazizi incident in Tunisia.
Sure.
That sparked the Arab Spring. How different and how similar is this event with what we have been watching in George Floyd, in the aftermath of killing of George Floyd?
Look, let's take a step back. I think that there's been a number of sort of global incidents in recent years that have gone, sort of viral on a level that is, kind of very, very contemporary, and have created, these sort of waves of change and waves of consideration and ways of thinking. Yes, Mohammed Bouazizi and the self-immolation in Tunisia sparked the Arab Spring, and that created all sorts of reverberations around the world. There was the Charlie Hebdo incident in Paris where, terrorists killed a bunch of cartoonists, and that opened up a discussion around the world about freedom of speech. But I think one of the most sort of salient comparison also happened in the United States was the Me Too movement, and how that opened up a whole discussion worldwide, not just the United States, about gender relations, about, sexual harassment in the workplace and in other public spaces and so on. So I think this falls into that category, if I make any sense, of like these unique viral global moments that we've been experiencing from time to time in the last couple decades.
So it will remain mostly as, do you think it is part of the social media activism or hashtag activism?
It's way more than that. But
yeah.
Look, it starts with hashtag Black Lives Matter, Me Too, but then it, transforms into the streets, into the courts, into the UN General Assembly, which is opening a discussion on this topic of racism. It, becomes discussed in Parliament. It becomes the subject of TV series and TV shows. It maybe starts with a hashtag, but it goes way beyond social media to the streets and to the public spaces of the world as well.
Okay, Dr. Fung, the examples that Mr. Daragahi gave about the Charlie Hebdo incident and the Arab Spring and the demonstrations in the US is creating some global movement, actually. What is happening in Hong Kong and why it is not creating the same global repercussion at the social level, at least?
Yeah, that is interesting. And people already point out that the comparability and similarity of the situation of police brutality in Hong Kong and in the US. And actually, in the early days of the George Floyd protest in Minneapolis, and actually, in some social media and some media also capture some image. Actually, some protester has learning or copying tactics of Hong Kong protesters. For example, they see people spraying slogan like "Be water," hit and run with the police and things like that in Hong Kong. So there's one thing is that protesters in the U.S. did watch the police brutality in Hong Kong and then the protests against that, and so there's some kind of influence there. And at the same time that we don't see the large-scale protests in support of the Black Lives Matter in the U.S. in Hong Kong yet, but you can see that the sentiment is that the people in Hong Kong has been fighting the same, though it's not related to racial injustice, but it is this similar level of police brutality. So they have been continuing it, and by continuing the fight against police brutality in Hong Kong is to be in solidarity and honoring the George Floyd protests in the U.S. And so the George Floyd protest is about racial injustice in the U.S., but at the issue of police brutality, it also has this kind of global repercussion because militarization of police forces has been quite a trend around the world now, that the U.S., not only U.S., but also in Europe, in Hong Kong. So they have all these kind of a commonality of targeting the marginalized group. In the case of the Europe, it is the ghetto and the suburban area with a lot of migrants that the police are targeting them with brutal tactics and militarized gears. In the US, it is the black neighborhoods. And in Hong Kong, it is the young people who are unhappy with the authoritarian rule. So in Hong Kong, we already see this discussion about, and actually the development of George Floyd protest is being watched closely, and then people acknowledge the fact that in the US, their protest is long deep-seated injustice, but also there's this kind of electoral collection and legislative process that might be able to correct the process. And for example, that they noticed that even President Trump, who speaks not very highly of the protester, has signed an executive order to put forward some kind of reformed police reform measure, and the Congress, the Democrats are also pushing for police reform. So they are watching it, and then still very admiring the kind of free and open system in the U.S., though despite its imperfection, that is they think is better than in the Hong Kong system, in which the police is not charged. Police that commit brutality is not indicted, and the government is not responding to all this criticism of police brutality.
One general question that comes from our audience as well about the US image around the globe. And this is, I think this is constantly a recurring, at least for the last 20 years, we have seen this as a recurring issue about the US image abroad. After the Iraq war, after the Abu Ghraib incident, after the financial meltdown, after Trump's presidency, we keep seeing this debate about US images declining, and this decline will create a credibility gap for the US foreign policy in the future. But as the things move forward, we started to see as a new normal. Yes, US is not as popular as it used to be, but it is still superpower, and it is still credible, and many people around the world keep seeing United States as a country of last resort in terms of crisis, global crisis, or in terms of anything. So with the Floyd incident, George Floyd incident, and its aftermath, what happened to US image? And do you think something drastically changed about US image, or is it something that has been already known about the US, and things are just moving forward as is? Dr. Hung.
I think there's two things. One is the image of the U.S. government, or the incumbent government, definitely after George Floyd and after the mismanagement of the pandemic, that the Trump administration, which already is not very popular around the world, its image continue to tank. And it is the same as you mentioned, that during the Iraq war, under George W. Bush, and the anti-war movement in the U.S. also triggered a wave of anti-war movement. And the 1999 Seattle anti-WTO protest also helped trigger a wave of anti-globalization movement around the world. And then, so there's a kind of ups and downs, and there's a cycle. Then when Obama was get elected, the U.S. image seemed to recover, not totally, but at least a bit better than George W. Bush. And so there will be, I will expect that this kind of cycle will continue, depending on the direction of the election and who is going to control the Congress after November. But there's one thing of it. Then another thing is that the image of the U.S. as a kind of a free society, vibrant civil society. It is the image of the U.S. civil society. So I think for a long time, the U.S. civil society, even though at times when the U.S. government, sitting government, is not very well respected and regarded around the world, the U.S. civil society still get the kind of inspiration. They'll become an inspiration for people around the world. For example, during the civil rights movement, Martin Luther King, and all this social movement and anti-war movement in the 60s and 70s. And then, as I said, during the George W. Bush administration, though the Iraq war is not very popular, but U.S. civil society mobilizing against the war, becoming inspiration around the world. And this time around, the George Floyd protests it's mentioned about the Me Too movement as well, that it become an inspiration for the feminists around the world. And I would like to add that in China, actually, there's a Chinese version of the Me Too movement that the Chinese government actually shut it down and scaled it very soon, that women start to accuse professors and officials of sexual abuse and things like that. So the U.S. soft power, not only about its government and authorities, it's also about its vibrant civil society and its protests, its mobilization. despite the unpopularity of the government, I think the U.S. civil society and the movement and the mobilization will continue to become to be a kind of inspiration of people who want to seek justice around the world.
Mr. Daragahi, the same question.
Well, I mean, you asked a very, very broad question. I'll just, sort of put it this way. I think that, anyone who believed in this sort of myth of American infallibility and invincibility of this sort of all-knowing conspiratorial power, I hope over the last 17 years, you all see what a disaster the U.S. is, what a, incompetent clown show it can be with Iraq. With the botching of Iraq. And if you think that that was, the plan, that their plan was to, mire themselves in a, long war in Iraq and drain the economy and so on, that it was pure incompetence. It's pure incompetence, the handling of the COVID-19 pandemic. And it's, pure incompetence in terms of what's, happening in terms of the whole political structure of the country. Look, I mean, in many ways, the U.S. right now is a failed state. Its cities are burning. The economy is a disaster. Foreign powers like the United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, Israel, even Turkey are, sort of playing games in Washington and manipulating domestic politics. I mean, it might as well be Lebanon, the number of foreign powers that have the ear of this particular White House, for example, and have influence in Washington. And so it is a kind of a disastrous mess in the United States right now. As my colleague pointed out earlier, the civil society is rather vibrant, but even that is flawed. Yes, they go out into the streets, but for God's sake, they don't vote. They don't show up on election day to vote. They, come up and protest and go into the streets and hold colorful banners and inspire everyone in the world. But when it counts, they don't show up at the polls in very large numbers. And so, even that, the civil society has severe defects. So I hope, if anything, if the last 17 years has taught us anything, is that there is no, American puppet master. It's just a bunch of amateurs.
So you said they don't, they don't vote, and because of that, it will not get any political influence. I'm not sure if you have followed. Yesterday there was primaries, including some districts of New Jersey.
But look at the numbers of people who voted in those primaries. Yes, people. Yeah, go ahead.
Three African Americans were basically defeated. Three influential members of the House. Do you think it will have any repercussions? Do you think this wave will continue until the November or not?
It might, but I mean, those primary elections, I know what you're pointing to, not defeated like some
Engels and his loss.
Elliot Engels, some conservative Democrats, conservative especially on foreign policy. Yeah. Elliot Engels, very pro-Israel hawk. Defeated by a candidate, an African-American candidate who was supported by Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren, the sort of progressive wing. But look at the numbers of people who voted in those primaries. I'm sorry, but it's rather pathetic. In like some of the most populated, heavily populated districts of New York, 36,000 people showed up to vote in those primaries. I mean, that's so yeah, out of 36,000 people who voted in a district that's probably like 1 million people, this guy won. But that's a very tepid, pathetic turnout in a Democratic primary. And if they can't get their numbers, like if the US had the turnout rates that Turkey has, which is like basically 80 or 90%, you wouldn't have any Republicans in the whole Congress at this point. If they had the high numbers of participation, if they had some kind of like if they had Australia levels of participation, it would be a completely different political game in the United States. But they don't. They barely get above 50% participation in presidential elections. And that is a disaster. So yeah, people go out in the street and it's fun and they feel empowered. And then when it comes November 3rd, they don't show up.
Dr. Hong, are you as pessimist as Mr. Daragahi?
Yes and no. That it is without doubt that U.S. voter turnout in comparison with other democracies or new democracies, old democracies, are relatively low. But at the same time, I won't blame the voters for all of these issues because there's some institutional. So the U.S. electoral system and democratic system has its problem. That there's some institutional roadblock for people to vote. For example, there's the issues of voter disenfranchisement, particularly in some red state that is an issue for a long time, that minorities are very much discouraged by all kind of measures of the local official to vote. And at the same time, there is the electoral system that in particularly in presidential election, that many people think that they are in a very solid red state or blue state. They don't count, so they're not enthusiastic to vote. So internationally, comparatively, that U.S. has a relatively low turnout rate, but historically, you can see this up and down. So it depends on the issues and depends on the atmosphere. And last time Trump got elected, many people analyze it's because of the low turnout among the Democrats, that people are frustrated with the candidates at that time. So a lot of minorities didn't vote. In Michigan, that Trump won Michigan partly because not only African American that would have come out to vote didn't come out, but also some white Union Democrats voter, they didn't come out and handed the state to Trump, and in many swing states. So this time we will see. For one thing, there's a lot of discussion this time because of the pandemic. People are talking about mail-in ballots that will definitely increase the voting rate, because all this kind of voting place has a lot of problem, and people who run the voting place might have discrimination against the minorities, so they find it more difficult to vote. And in some places, there's a long line that is discouraging. If the mail-in vote become a reality, then it can definitely increase the vote turnout. And then many people on the Democratic side hope that the turnout this time will increase, also because people don't really want to see another 4 years of Trump, so that the Democratic side turnout rate might increase. So the 2018 midterm election might be a sign that this turnout rate has upped because of the 2 years of Trump already, and then the Democratic side is energized, and they have some exciting candidates, and we will see in November. But definitely internationally, US has a lot of job to do to increase the voter participation. At the same time, we will see whether the cycle of ups and downs of voter turnout will have its way in November to increase the turnout rate in the November election.
Do you expect the mobilization and the wave that 2008 actually created when President Obama was elected, or not? Do you see the same level of activism at that time? Especially the youth voters were considered as a critical part of Obama's victory.
Unfortunately, I don't see a lot, because, for example, the pandemic really is a kind of huge hurdle, that now that they have difficulty doing even the census because of these restrictions given by the pandemic. So this Obama type get out the vote and voter registration campaign is very difficult. Back in 2008, they were actually knocking door to door to register a voter. Now it's not difficult. It's very difficult to do it. And at the same time, back in 2008, they have a very exciting candidates. Many young people think that it is really a kind of a making history. So they are very excited. They're energized. And actually, the research did show that a lot of the Obama voter turnout operation is done by the anti-globalization, anti-war movement. Many of the activists became the kind of ground troops of Obama campaign to get out the vote. And this time around, that unfortunately Biden seems to be not yet developed this kind of machines among the young people. All add up that I don't see that the voter turnout can be as high as back in 2008, particularly like the most enthusiastic young voters. Early on, they are supportive of Sanders or Elizabeth Warren, but now that they kind of turn off by the Biden's win, so there might be a kind of worry about this division within the Democratic camp. Whether the Biden supporter will come out enthusiastically to vote for Biden is a question. But of course, then this time around is different in the sense that Trump is a kind of can be potentially a big unifier among all the Democrats and liberals and even some Republicans. We see now that they start to press their voting for Biden. So we will see. It's very highly uncertain circumstance. We have never seen it before, having elections in the middle of a pandemic and with such a polarizing president as an incumbent.
It was reported that Bernie Sanders and Joe Biden has actually a team of people working together, a joint task force, if we can call it, to somehow create a consensus. Probably Biden is trying to get that mobilization effort of the Sanders behind him in the election. Do you think he will be successful to achieve that?
It is difficult because people on the left is already has a lot of complaint about Sanders giving in too early, and they're still unhappy about the Democratic establishment. So there's a lot of manning work to do for the Biden campaign to woo the supporters of Biden Sanders supporter. Even though Bernie Sanders come out enthusiastically endorse Joe Biden, that his followers might not be buying into that. So it depends on what Biden is going to do, and definitely the vice presidential candidate is going to be very important. There's a lot of discussion about a minority or women should be wooed to become the vice presidential candidates, and to make up the disadvantage of Biden as a very traditional and establishment, even old figures. So they need to do something to energize the base of the Democrat, particularly young people. And Obama turnout is high, and then he won by kind of a landslide because of the young, enthusiastic voter. And Biden cannot just count on the universal this unhappiness about Trump among the Democrat voters, and he need to go further and do further. But it depends.
Mr. Daragahi, the same question. Do you think, is there any chance that there will be another Obama wave in 2020 presidential elections?
I mean, I don't think that anyone could match the coalition and the ground game and the sort of enthusiasm that Obama generated. But I think that, there have been studies done, and I'm not a political scientist, about what motivates people to vote. And more they're discovering that, hate and anger could be just as motivating as, enthusiasm for a candidate. And, although an Obama wave is not in the works, perhaps an anti-Trump wave is even more powerful because, I mean, I've never experienced, myself, I'm sometimes shocked by the level of hatred and anger, almost sort of violent anger that people in the United States have against Trump when they talk about him. And the vindictiveness and venom they have for his supporters and his staff and so on. As my colleague said, it's a very polarized environment. And people are motivated to vote. They'll vote for Biden. He's a safe bet. I think that, yes, you're not going to get young people voting for him enthusiastically, but you might get young people voting for Biden holding their nose. And as some people have pointed out, among African Americans, there's a lot of respect for Joe Biden because this is a guy, an old white guy, who for 8 years stood by Barack Obama's side, a younger, smarter, more handsome guy than himself, never once publicly questioned him, never once put him in his place, so to speak, was super eager to play second fiddle to this young, cool African American guy. And that has built a lot of respect. This is why he has so much, this is why Biden has so much respect in the traditional African-American communities, is because of that experience. And so, people will vote for him out of respect. There's also some numbers that are kind of interesting, suggesting that senior citizens are, if not, they're like more, or if not as supportive of Biden as they are of Trump. Now that's really startling because, old white people are the people who voted for Trump. But what is showing up in these numbers is that a lot of people, voters 65 and older, are actually as enthusiastic, as supportive of Biden as they are of Trump. That's super interesting.
Yeah, just today's New York Times poll showed that people 65 plus, Biden is leading by 1%, which basically in the 2016 election, I think it was Trump had 9% advantage with them. And in terms of the voting blocks, today's New York Times poll showed that the only group actually that Trump has still lead on is the non-college educated white voters. And in that, Trump still has a lead, and is probably be an interesting election to watch. And there's a question, Dr. Hung, to you about Tim Cotton's piece on New York Times and timing. And one of the first people actually that responded to that piece was the New York Times Beijing correspondent, actually, because it was the anniversary of the Tiananmen incident. So what do you say about that?
It is a very bad timing that on the anniversary of the Tiananmen, that the whole world condemned China at that time, sending the military to deal with peaceful protester, and Tom Cotton and even at some point the president toying with the ideas of using the military to crack down on protests in Washington, D.C. So it is a very bad reminder and parallel. And then people, I think, have a good reason to criticize this kind of talk, that this to actually tarnish U.S. the reputation in the world, that it is not the people supposed to think that's supposed to happen in the U.S. Of course, that then if you watch from a kind of a longer perspective, definitely that is still not comparable, because back in 1989 in Beijing, once the supreme leader decided to use the military, that basically there's the path is unopposed and all the way lead to the June 4th massacre. But in the U.S., that it shows that the system, no matter how much flaws, how much problem it has, it still works. That this check and balance. That you don't even if you have a supreme leader, the presidents or some high-rank officials are very interested in using the military to deal with protests. But you see, after Tom Cotton's article, after Trump talked openly about the possible use of military, then you see all this pushback from people in the establishment, including Republicans in Congress, are distancing themselves from these. Their voice from Pentagon, retired generals, retired military people speaking out against it, and in the end, it didn't happen. And Trump demobilized the National Guards very soon, and the whole thing got diffused and didn't end up in a kind of a Tiananmen situation. And now, a few weeks later, that the situation's mostly calmed down. And people are looking at how to reform the police, and the discussion moved to this, how to remedy for the root cause of the protest. So in the in the longer sort, you can still see, and people can see it. So it's why the Chinese government take in an opportunistic way to talk about the U.S. protests, U.S. how horrible it is, but at the same time, it still censor the news and don't want people to see actually what is happening in the U.S. in the long run, and how the system works to prevent a tragedy from happening.
Mr. Daragahi, a question for you. You called United States a failed state after these demonstrations. And is this...
not just the demonstration.
Is there something new? It has been called failed state after Vietnam, after the oil crisis. There was a lot of debate about the US decline in 1980s. Even people like Paul Kennedy assumed that 1990s Japan will be superpower. In 2000s, we have a huge literature on American decline and the end of United States supremacy. So what is new with these demonstrations that made you say that it's a failed state?
No, I mean, first of all, I'll just put one caveat. Failed state is it's like a neat academic term.
Yeah.
You know, we can debate the merits of that. But actually what makes the United States resemble a failed state is not the fact that there's demonstrations. Maybe that's healthy in a way, that there's popular demonstrations. What makes it a failed state is the police response to those demonstrations, and the burning and the torching and the use of military hardware, even though they didn't do the ultimate crackdown that Trump and Tom Cotton were threatening. That makes it one dimension of the failed state. But the biggest dimension of the United States being potentially called a failed state is the amount of foreign influence there is in the government and government affairs. It has become an open casino in the United States in terms of foreign countries going in there, buying space in K Street in Washington, hiring lobbyists, and then, you know, kind of basically cajoling lawmakers and even the White House to do their bidding. In that sense, it's, you know, more like a Libya or a Lebanon where you have foreign powers moving in and, you know, moving the government this way and that, getting control of their various factions. Qatar has its people in Congress. United Arab Emirates has the ear of Jared Kushner. Saudi Arabia has the ear of Mike Pompeo. Putin and Trump keep talking and going this way and that. Erdogan talks with Trump all the time, influences foreign decisions and so on. And in that sense, it's a failed state. These are, you know, foreign powers moving in and manipulating the country's foreign policies and sometimes domestic policies.
One more question to you, Mr. Daragahi, from Mohammed Sohrab. It's a long question, but he's mentioning the treatment of Palestinians and Israel and questioning why there is not much debate in civil society in the West about that. And is the West policy vis-a-vis Israel guided by the democratic imperatives or by the geopolitical considerations?
I think that in the West, people are just tired and worn out by the question of Israel and Palestine. There is a lot of sympathy in, you know, the Democratic Party. Just today, we were talking about one of the most stridently pro-Israel candidates in the US Congress, defeated by an African-American progressive who has been openly critical of this congressman's Israel policy. So there is a debate. It's not completely shut down. There are two wings in the Democratic Party in the United States, a very pro-Israel, pro-Likudnik wing, and a much more enlightened wing in the Democratic Party of the United States. And, you know, there's a constant fight between, you know, the people who are sort of traditional pro-Israelites and those who are much more balanced in their approach. And so I don't think the debate is over. I think people are still talking about it. I think that there is still sympathy for the Palestinian cause and for a just and peaceful solution to that terrible conflict.
Okay, we have 5 minutes, and the last question for both of you is, Professor Hong, do you think this mobilization of Black Lives Matter would bring a consolidation in the Trump base or the white supremacists, which would mobilize them in the elections as well?
Definitely, this what the conservative analysts hope for, or what Trump would hope for, that Trump already reiterated the word law and order quite a number of times since the protest started, and he knows that it is what hand Nixon's landslide victory after the unrest in 1968. There's this law and order, this fear of law and order among white conservative people might be energized with this anxiety about the social fabric and social order breakdown and increase in crime and order. So it might have some effect, and how big effect we don't know. That if the unrest turn to more violent directions in the months to come, and then it will definitely worry these people. But at this time, we see that the situation already calmed down. So it might not have that much an effect on that. And more important is how the economy and how the pandemic situation is look like in the fall. That now we already see a sign of rebounds of cases of COVID-19 and the second wave incoming, and then the stock market today after some time of rally and go south again. So it depends, and in the end, many voters, when they go to vote, the practical voter, they are asking whether their life is better off now in comparison to 4 years ago. If the answer is negative, that they are worse off. In many of the predictions about electoral outcome, that usually if many people feel that their life is worse than 4 years ago, that the incumbent president up for re-election will be in trouble. So Trump will not be an exception. So I would say it is highly volatile situation right now. And we never have this kind of a the election in this situation before, in the middle of the pandemic, in a kind of a polarizing environment, and at the same time that there's a lot of things that can happen between now and November.
And how should we interpret the fact that, especially in major cities, in the demonstrations, in some of them actually the predominant majority was the white, not the African Americans. So how should we interpret this change? This is probably the first time that they play a more central role, actually.
And many of the cities are actually that the place affected mostly by the demonstration is actually quite the deep blue places, like Minneapolis and Minnesota and New York and all the East Coast and West Coast in California. So it's interesting that we need to factor this into our prediction or our calculation about how it affects the election. And how would the people in the swing state will think that I bet that in the end, the people in the swing state that deliver Trump the presidencies like Michigan, Pennsylvania, those places that in the end that the result of the election there will be determined by the economy and by the situation of the pandemic primarily.
Mr. Daragahi, the same question about the right-wing potential right-wing consolidations. Do you expect something like that?
No. I mean, two things. First of all, Trump's got his base of support, and that base of support has rarely moved over the last 4 years. He has his solid supporters, his core, and he's not reached out to those in the middle, and he's not won any of those new supporters. So then it becomes a question of voter turnout on election day. And the other thing is, yes, if Hillary Clinton was president, and there was riots and unrest, and a challenger like Donald Trump came and said, law and order, law and order, law and order, that would be, effective. But when you're the president and you're barking law and order as there's riots going on, you've failed already. You've already created, the law and order voters are disappointed in you. You did not impose law and order. You completely failed. So, that happened in, to David Dinkins, David Mayor of New York, and David Dinkins, the election that brought Giuliani to power. It works for Republicans when they do that. It sometimes works for Democrats when they do that. But as challengers, it doesn't work when you're an incumbent and you say that I'm the law and order guy and people are burning down the cities. No, you already, it's too late. So I think that the unrest, which is tapered down already, which was largely caused by heavy-handed police tactics, has already kind of cooled and turned into peaceful vigils and protests that are regular and not any, kind of dramatic events. And two, it's over for him, I think, to some extent. He's not going to expand his base. People who are thinking about those few people who were fence sitters, they're going to go with Joe Biden at this point. And so it just becomes a question of turnout and ground game on election day, and knowing Trump, how much he can cheat.
Don't you think now he's accusing of actually the mayor of Minneapolis or mayor of Seattle actually for being too progressive, for being too lenient for the demonstrators? Do you think that that's kind of strategy of scapegoating would work for him or not?
It might work among his hardcore supporters, but we're talking about whatever, like the suburban soccer mom living outside of Philadelphia. No, I think it'll work with the core constituency that he has. But you're a middle-aged small business owner outside of Ann Arbor in Ann Arbor, Michigan, in the suburbs of Detroit. You're looking at your economy. The economy's gone bad. You're basically not able to pay your 1 or 2 employees. Your kids have not been going to school. Things are horrible. Things are terrible. They're much worse than they were 4 years ago. And then this guy is barking on TV all the time about, liberals and, going on and on about Barack Obama 4 years ago and talking about CIA conspiracies and FBI conspiracies against him. That's not going to really help with those particular voters.
Thank you very much. The very last question, Dr. Hung, is there any, especially when we were talking about COVID and even when we were talking about the Floyd case, we are talking about a little bit about economy and how the social economic conditions impact the election. Do you expect, is there anything that can surpass the influence of economy or the social economic inequalities in the United States in the elections.
But
If
common
you were
wisdom is
Trump campaign, what
Yeah.
would you advise him to win the election, knowing Trump and his ideological?
it will be very difficult. It will be a very difficult job to do it. But the common wisdom is that if you are entrenched and in this kind of bad situation, you are desperate and you might risk and gamble on starting a war or something that to make your opponent cannot oppose you, but mobilize the nationalist sentiments. But I doubt whether even that would work given the situation. That I think if people put bet on the table, that I don't think a lot of people will put bet on the table that Trump will win the election. But of course, that after the 2016, that everybody predictions is wrong, that nobody can say for sure everything can happen. But for Republican, I think what they worry about now is not about whether Trump is get reelected. I suspect many of them already prepare for the worst in the presidential election, but they will need to work more on the Senate's elections, that whether they can hold on to the majority in the Senate, that it for them, I think more important to not to be dragged by Trump and to lose control on the Senate, and it is why you see some Republicans are starting to distance themselves from Trump, and some even speak openly against Trump and saying that they're going to vote for Joe Biden. So it is a tough call for them. It is an uphill battle for them, and then the economy and the situation of the pandemic. Unless there's some miracle happen, that I don't think this situation can improve dramatically over the next few months. It's going to take time for the economy and the society to recover from all that.
Mr. Daragahi, you seem to be not willing to be an advisor for Trump campaign, but if you were so, would you have any kind of strategy, any winning strategy or game changer that he can basically change this situation?
I mean, I think it might be a little too late, you know, but I mean, if a year ago he had changed track and, you know, run as a sort of limousine Republican, you know, gone to the center, like, you know, you have center-right politicians in the world who are smart. You know, Recep Tayyip Erdogan at the beginning of the pandemic, he was like, he said one really smart thing, for example. He said, you know what, let's listen to the scientists. If he had done something, if Trump had done something like that at the beginning of the pandemic, instead of being this idiotic bully throughout this whole thing, that might have softened his image in the minds of those, you know, moderate voters, you know, but he's just not capable of it. He's not capable of, you know, thinking in a three-dimensional way. He just like wants to feed red meat to his supporters and get them riled up, and has not shown any capability whatsoever of stealing votes from the center.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Dr. Hung, and thank you, Mr. Daragahi. And
Thank you.
for our audience, next week we will have another webinar on China-US relations, and hope to see you again. Thank you very much.
Thanks.